Welcome, everybody. My name is Stephanie Baxter. I'm the Director of Programming and Engagement at the New Hampshire Tech Alliance. Thank you for joining us today. As a quick reminder, this event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel after the event. And there will, of course, be an opportunity for questions at the end as well, and feel free to put them in the chat or unmute. We'll talk about that as we go. This webinar today is brought to you by the Cybersecurity Review Program. The program is a partnership between the New Hampshire Tech Alliance and the New Hampshire SBDC and provides free cybersecurity reviews for businesses with under 500 employees. Organizations will get to meet with a cybersecurity expert and will come away with an achievable, actionable plan for protecting their business. As you will see from the webinar today, threats are more present than ever, and small to medium-sized businesses are extremely vulnerable. I'll pop the link to the program in the chat during the discussion, as well as my contact information if you have any questions. I'd now like to introduce our speakers for today. Cameron Shilling is an attorney and director at McLane, Middleton, and is also the chair of the firm's Cybersecurity and Privacy Group. His resume includes managing numerous data security audits, preparing and implementing written security policies, training executives, managers, and employees in data security, auditing, preparing and implementing data security agreements with vendors and business associates, and addressing a wide variety of day-to-day security issues and investigating and remediating many security breaches. Paige Yeater is the Director of Information Security at Mainstay Technologies. In this role, she works with clients across many industries of many sizes, supporting their information security programs. Paige has nearly 20 years of experience in training, client operations, and program management, and she works to align business operations with security and compliance requirements. Most of her time is spent building programs to help support clients in their security journey. She and her team work with clients to educate them on their security risk and compliance requirements and to align their business processes with a strong security posture. And Paige is also the New Hampshire Tech Alliance 2021 Tech Professional of the Year. So I would now like to turn it over to Kim and Paige.
Thank you.
Wow, Paige, you didn't tell me you're so important. I feel so lucky that we work together.
You should feel that anyway.
Yeah. So it's great that we have a small group, because I know Paige and I both hope that because we have a small group, you will be engaged. You get 45 minutes to an hour with two experts in the field. So take this opportunity to ask us questions as we go along. So we have, what we want to do is cover two really prominent and prolific types of risk and threat, and talk a little bit about what they are, why they happen, and how to prevent them. And then talk to you about more than just how to prevent a particular type of attack or reduce a particular type of risk, how to attain a more comprehensive cybersecurity readiness and posture, and how to really make your business resilient to any type of attack that might come your way. So that's our agenda for today. Paige is going to be our expert. I'm going to be a bit of the moderator, but we'll both try to impart our wisdom to you as well.
Yep.
Paige,
I know people are. I was just going to say, I know people are probably eating because it's noon, but feel free to turn your cameras on. We'd love to see your faces, and feel free to unmute, ask questions throughout. We're happy to have that sort of conversational approach. Yep.
Awesome. So I'm going to start off by teeing up the two most prominent types of risk that exist today. The first one is something that we call business email compromise. You might know it as a man-in-the-middle attack, and more commonly, it essentially involves electronic cyber financial fraud. So, Paige, will you kick us off by telling us what this threat is, what this attack is, and how it happens?
Yeah, so this is really the most sort of prolific, like you said. There is there are a variety of ways that an individual could compromise your email, but this is where we're seeing the vast majority of compromise happen. The compromise either comes through a hacker guessing your username and password. It comes through finding your username and password on the dark web because it was included in a breach of some sort that happened previously. So, you can all probably just think back in your memory and think, oh yeah, I was part of the LinkedIn breach, or I was part of the Experian breach, or I was part of the Chase breach, or I was part of the Target breach. I could probably go on, but if you were part of any of those, right, you might have a username and password out on the dark web. And if you ever reuse that username and password for your email, somebody knows it. Somebody knows it. Somebody has access to it. The other thing that we see a lot of is what you may have heard of is phishing testing, or not testing, just phishing emails. Phishing is when somebody sends you an email and they try to trick you into giving them your username and password. This happens pretty successfully, unfortunately. There was a recent study around, the use of phishing in 2021, and something like 64% of email compromise, business email compromise, were directly tied to somebody failing to identify that an email was a phishing email. So this is a pretty common way that this happens. And there's a lot of really aggressive tactics out there. So during COVID, there were a lot of emails that were flying around that were about, hey, here's how you get, COVID, benefits. Here's how you get COVID information. And people were clicking on things and trying to log into, what they thought was a legitimate account, but isn't actually. And, if that happens, then your email is now compromised. And so basically what happens is through any one of these methods, they get access to your username and password to your email, and then they log into your email account. And now they have full control over your email account. So you can imagine why that is a little bit of a nightmare. Think about what would happen if somebody were to get into your email account. What could they do?
And so, Paige, tell us what they do. In fact, how do these financial fraud, man-in-the-middle scams occur? Once someone's in somebody else's email account, what do they do? How do they perpetrate this crime?
Yeah, so we see a couple of different things. We see that, if somebody gets into your email, they could do a variety of things. They could start sending email as you. So one of the horror stories that we have seen is that somebody gets their email compromised, and then a phishing email goes out from their email, which is a legitimate email, to their contacts, which are legitimate contacts. And the people who receive those emails think, oh, this is a legitimate email from a legitimate person that I know. I should be safe to click on it. And that's not actually true. And so they end up clicking on it. We also see from a fraud perspective, what they do is they start intercepting email communication. Most of the time when they get access to your email, they kind of sit and watch for a little bit. We're seeing less sort of immediate compromise. We're seeing a little bit more time between actual compromise of the account and then any actions taken. So they kind of are watching. They're kind of looking to see what's happening. They're kind of looking to see what your trends, what your habits are. They're looking to see, if they get into, somebody who is a finance manager, for example, or an accounting manager, they look to see how invoices are sent out, and then they will impersonate you sending out invoices, or they will create a rule that says every time this person sends out an email that has an attachment that says, this is an invoice, or has, invoice in the subject, it will amend a note on the bottom that says, please note our new banking information. So then people start paying the wrong bank account. Because it's not a legitimate bank account. So they divert funds that way. The other thing that we see is when there's two parties that are having a conversation about making a payment, they intercept and they sort of stand in the middle, and they're having conversations in both directions. So the two parties at the end think that they're talking to each other, when in reality, they're both talking to a hacker in the middle. And so that man in the middle can negotiate different terms, can negotiate different payment amounts, can negotiate different banking, EFT information. And what ends up happening is that organizations often end up transferring out sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars to the wrong account. And once it's gone, it's gone. You guys may have heard of the recent situation in Peterborough. There was some business email, or there was some scamming there, and there was a compromise there, and they ended up sending money to the wrong bank account. So we see this a lot. I'm sure, Cam, you've seen this. repeatedly.
This is the number one way for businesses to lose money directly from hackers. It really dwarfs hackers accessing directly a bank account. There's so many controls on bank accounts now, including multi-factor authentication and dual authorization and stuff like that. Hackers can much more easily perpetrate this type of scam and walk away with $50,000, $100,000, $250,000. Much easier to do that than get into an actual bank account. So let's talk a little bit about how this gets prevented, what we can do as businesses to prevent it. And what I want to start off by saying is we have to have things in place that are better than just people. And we will talk about people and training and business processes, but these folks are really good. Gone are the days where the English is broken or it doesn't make sense, or they send a lot of emails back and forth. And so you can kind of discern eventually that this is not really the person that you need to be talking to. This stuff is really, really sophisticated. And so we have to have technological barriers and person barriers and human barriers. So the first thing to know is if this happens to you, either you lose money or someone who's means to send you money doesn't get to you, act fast, really fast. Hours in a day make a difference. And the reason is that banks, particularly sophisticated commercial banks in the Western Hemisphere, typically are going to hold money for a day or two, particularly large transfers of money, particularly to new accounts, because they know that that's how fraud is perpetrated. So if you can get to the bank and or to federal law enforcement within a day, we stand a decent chance of getting some of the money back. Not always true, but decent chance. Get past 2 days and there's almost no chance of getting the money back. And make no mistake about getting the money back is the most important thing. So that's number one. Number two is we have to make our passwords strong and unique. The way this scam happens is not because, sometimes it can be because you have weak passwords. That's not a good thing. And passwords can be guessed if they're weak. But most often it happens the way Paige said, that someone else's site is hacked, Yahoo or LinkedIn or something like that. And the scammers use the password and try to get in other places. So we have to make our employees have unique passwords only to get into our business systems, and strong. So the strength we can mandate, you have to have length requirements and complexity requirements, but we also have to make sure that we change them often enough so employees don't reuse them other places. We can of course tell employees not to reuse them other places, but that's not a technological barrier. That's a human barrier, and human barriers tend to break. So strong, unique passwords. That's the first technological barrier. The second, and probably equally, if not more important than strong and unique passwords, is something called multi-factor authentication. So we have to, on all of our key systems, like email, like our VPN, our remote access, and even necessarily access on site, we have to have employees authenticate themselves by some other means other than a password. So typically that involves a text message to a cell phone, a secondary authenticator like Duo. There's lots of different secondary authenticators. Microsoft Office has its own system of multi-factor authentication. Google has its own called Google Authenticator, but somehow apply a multi-factor authentication system to any critical business system we have, including email. So those are the two big technological barriers to prevent this type of thing from happening. Talk about a couple of human barriers. Before I kind of go to the human barriers, anybody have any questions so far? Or Paige, you have anything to insert before we kind of talk about the human barriers?
The only thing that I would add is that, when we talk about strong passwords and we talk about multi-factor authentication, this is usually where people start to roll their eyes at us because they're like, yeah, I know. But, an average US citizen has somewhere in the ballpark of like 150 different accounts, usernames, passwords. There's no way you're going to remember all that. So we strongly recommend the use of a password manager, both in your personal and your professional lives. Usually that's a little bit counterintuitive. People are like, so to protect my passwords, you want me to put them all together on the internet? Yeah, that's exactly what we want you to do. There's a lot of information out there about password managers, and we can provide some additional detail if there's interest in that. But certainly a password manager is going to encourage your staff to create longer, stronger passwords. They're going to be things that are complex. They're not going to be real dictionary words, so they're going to be less likely to be compromised. And they also are relieved of the pressure of having to keep track of those somewhere. You don't have to put them in an Excel spreadsheet. You don't have to put them on a sticky note. You don't have to put them on a note on your phone. So I strongly recommend the use of password managers. So if you haven't already considered that, that's something that I would recommend.
Yep. And with password managers and long and strong passwords, you can dispense, and MFA, with those two things in place, you can dispense with the need to change your passwords commonly, as long as you're doing one thing, and that is monitoring the dark web for your credentials. So Paige and I are going to kind of talk a little bit about at the end about really truly managing cybersecurity. But one of the things that's done by firms like Mainstay is to monitor the dark web for a business's credentials. And so that Mainstay would know if one of your employees' credentials were compromised, and then you change those credentials. And the nice thing is, with long, strong passwords and MFA, you don't have to change the credentials unless you know they've been compromised. And employees like that because then they don't have to be constantly creating a new password.
Agreed.
All right, so a couple of human factors here. So obviously we need to train employees. And training is important not just to prevent this type of risk, but it's important generally. Raising awareness about phishing risk, about social engineering risk, just raising their awareness so that they see the red flags when they go off, teaching them about how to recognize spoofed email addresses, how to recognize when not to click on attachments or links, that type of stuff. So we do need to raise their awareness. But more than that, with employees that are going to handle financial transactions, we need to have training and processes in place so that they know what to do when they're directed to make a payment. And these processes are almost always verifying through a second way that the payment instructions are correct. So typically, it'd be dialing a phone number that the employee knows connects them to the right person on the other end. They recognize the other person on the other end. They confirm the bank account number, and the other person says, "Yep, I sent you that email. That's the correct bank account number. Yep, that's where I want the money sent." So those are the human systems. I'll add one piece that's a technological improvement, particularly in the last year. There have become these financial portals that allow these transactions to occur. And so what happens with these portals, and these are used by companies that do a lot of financial transactions. Think of banks, title companies, closing companies, attorneys, accountants, financial services companies that do a lot of financial transactions. So there are commercial portals where when you have one party on one side, and another party on another side, instead of transacting information directly, there's a portal that sits in the middle. So this party logs in using their credentials with multi-factor authentication. This party logs in with their credentials. One party provides the payment instructions, the other party gets it, the money goes through these portals. And it would take a hack of the portal to compromise this transaction. And these portals are very secure. So if you're in a business that does a lot of this stuff, you definitely want to look into one of those portals. The last thing I'll say is that most companies should have cyber liability insurance. We'll talk about that a little later. Cyber liability insurance covers the loss of information. So it might cover some of your expenses from someone hacking into your email system. If they took information, it'll cover the forensics, the lawyers. What it won't cover, it will not cover loss of money. So if $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 is gone because it couldn't get recovered, typical cyber liability coverage doesn't cover that. You have to get that covered, you have to have a special type of crime policy, which is called, fraudulent transfer crime policy. It will be a special type of policy that covers it. It's the only way you get the money back if it's gone, otherwise gone. All right. I think that rounds out our first scenario. Anybody have any questions, thoughts on that, or Paige, anything I missed?
Nope.
All right, good. So let's transition to the next most prevalent type of risk and attack. And you know, this is typical hack. So in modern day terms, this comes typically as ransomware. So some malicious actor is going to hack into your system, going to download encryption software and encrypt you, or otherwise take down your system. So Paige, explain a little bit how this happens, you know, how an encryption scenario plays out, a ransomware scenario plays out, and you know how businesses hear from the hackers. Take us through how this is a horror story for businesses.
Yeah. So in this case, you know, we've already talked about the social engineering aspect of this, where, you know, when an individual can get into your system and get access to things through social engineering and through getting your users to give up their credentials. There's also this traditional idea of just getting hacked, which is taking advantage of a technical gap. That technical gap could be a patching issue. It could be an out-of-date operating system. It could be a vulnerability in a software application that you're using. It could be an issue with how your networking equipment is configured. So there are definitely gaps, right? If you think about applications, if you think about network equipment, they all have code. They all have a set of instructions that tell them how to function and what to do. And when you were talking about an application that has several millions of lines of code, sometimes there's gaps. Sometimes there are things that can get compromised. Sometimes there are things that hackers can take advantage of. And in those cases, they gain access to your system without sort of any credentials or any, you know, not coming through the front door. They're coming through the, you know, through the side window in the sunroom that nobody ever locks. And, you know, then they have free reign. They have access to do whatever it is that they need to do. And typically what they end up doing is they end up dropping off what we call a payload, which is basically just some code that performs certain actions. A lot of times what it will do is actually create a persistent connection so that whoever the hacker is in whatever country they're in can connect directly to your network whenever they so choose. Again, we see this happen. We see them watch because they need to understand what's happening on your network so that they know how best to compromise. But then what happens is they typically take copies of information and then they encrypt everything, which means that you no longer have access to anything. All of your files are encrypted, your endpoints are encrypted, your servers are encrypted. They lock it all down and then they demand that you pay them for the key to unlock all of your data, which is so gross. And it's a terrible experience. And, you know, clients, you know, people who go through this, if you're not ready for it, if you don't have all the right things in place, I mean, for some organizations, it's just a game over. You know, some organizations, it's just kind of an end, which is terrible. But yeah.
So Paige, say I'm a business that has great backups.
Yeah.
And so I'm never gonna pay a ransom because I can just restore my servers from my backups.
Sure.
Do I still have risk?
Of course.
Why?
Have you tested your backups? When was the last time you actually tested to see if they work?
Right.
Are you backing up everything? Here's one of the things that we see a lot of. Oh, all of our servers are backed up. Fantastic. We have 150 employees and they all keep all of their active work on their local machines, which means that none of that is backed up. So everything on the server, that's great, but your endpoints, if they're not backed up, if it's not a comprehensive strategy, great. The other question is, are your backups actually segmented from your network or are they actually part of your network? Because if that's the case, then they just got locked up as well. So if they're not completely offsite, completely segmented, ideally fully in the cloud, then your backups may or may not be helpful at all.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about the failover piece. Talk a little bit, Paige, about what's happened in the last 2-3 years where you get the ransom demand after the first one. So the first one comes and says, hey, if you want to unlock your system, you know, pay us $20,000 or $50,000 or $200,000, and then you don't do that. And then what happens next when you haven't paid the ransom?
Well, they come back and they say, oh, by the way, we actually stole your data, so we're going to put it on the dark web and we're going to expose all this information. Or they just come back and attack you again because you didn't actually solve the problems that, yeah.
So
Yeah,
I think that's been the horror story for business, even prepared businesses. Everyone has good backups, that type of stuff, but then they find out that once they've restored their system, the threat actors still have all the information. And if you're a professional services firm or a healthcare firm, the nightmare of that information potentially being released is catastrophic. All right. So Paige, can you give us kind of an outline of what a business needs to do to protect itself? And I'm using those words carefully because I'm hoping you talk a little bit about avoidance versus mitigation when you talk a little bit about these steps. So tell us about what businesses can do to protect themselves.
Yep. So avoidance is key, right? We want to always avoid if at all possible. So a lot of this comes back to your patching approach or patching hygiene. It comes back to your IT processes, how you're managing and monitoring devices, how you're ensuring things that are up to date and that all the security patches are applied. This goes for both applications and computers. So for example, if you are a business and you still have a Windows XP machine in your information system, which if you're in manufacturing or have any sort of machinery, sometimes that is a thing that happens. That's a huge gap because you can't actually patch or update those, and we know there's vulnerabilities in those pieces. Understanding what you have in your network and understanding how it's managed, working with your IT team or your IT provider to monitor the patching status. There was a most recent update for X, Microsoft X operating system. Have we applied that? If not, how come? When are we going to do it? How long are we exposed? The longer you go without patching and managing things is just creating additional risk. The other thing that I'll talk about here, which is a really big pain point for a lot of small business, is that if you have individuals who are bringing their own device, if you have a BYOD policy, meaning that people can use their personal machines to do work on, you have no control as an organization over how they're patching or managing that, which creates a significant amount of risk for you. So if you are a business that has that in place, I would strongly recommend that you look at how you're managing those devices, how your staff is managing those devices, and what kind of risk you might have there. The other thing that we recommend from an overarching network perspective is to make sure that you have perimeter protections in place, like a firewall, making sure that you have those external protections in terms of not being able to get connected to your network at all. We also recommend vulnerability scanning, which is basically just sort of an external, outside in kind of look at, where do we see vulnerabilities? So there are a lot of databases out there that keep track of vulnerabilities. There's hundreds of thousands of them out there, and you can run these scans. You can get these scans run. There's a variety of different ways to do that. But these basically highlight for you, these are the potential gaps in your information system, and this is potentially where somebody could get in. So if you are patching everything proactively, making sure that everything's staying up to date, that you're closing whatever security gaps your applications and your operating systems have in them, and then you're also vulnerability scanning to look and see where you have gaps, where you might have risk, and working proactively to close those things. Those are all really important things that can help avoid getting hacked.
All right, so let me ask you a question. I'm a business and I use strong antivirus, anti-malware.
Awesome.
I might have a Norton or an ESET or maybe Standard's Windows Defender. Why am I not safe from these types of ransomware attacks?
Mostly because they only alert you after something's already in your system. They don't proactively notify. They don't stop. They don't always stop. Sometimes they do, but they don't always stop things. Antivirus and anti-malware is pretty basic security at this point. We do recommend that this day and age, we're looking for what we call threat detection, sort of a more proactive, threat response, where it's identifying something and actually taking action for you. So endpoint detection and response is one of the things that you'll hear. It will actually prevent you from connecting to the network if it senses something, if you have been compromised, if something gets in. We had a situation a couple weeks ago where there was an organization that we were working with that has a user who works remotely. She got a weird notification. She clicked on it. She ended up downloading something that she thought was an update, but it wasn't. We had endpoint detection and response in place, and with a matter of 2.5 minutes, we had segmented her machine from the network, and so the malware that was on her machine couldn't go anywhere else. So we basically prevented a massive issue on that network, which is a big deal, and is really important when we're talking about making sure that we're protecting the network. We want antivirus and anti-malware, but we also want that threat detection and response. We want that sort of proactive approach to stopping things in their tracks.
Right, and this goes to the difference between avoidance and mitigation. Mm-hmm. The reality is, in modern day life, we can't avoid every risk.
Right.
A lot of cybersecurity is about minimizing the damage, and this type of application, this managed threat detection, is a way to stop damage from happening when it starts and really minimizes. But talk a little bit maybe about another mitigation step. So I'm a business that has really good offline backups. So I can, if my system gets encrypted, I can restore from backup. How long is it going to take me to restore, and what can I do during that period in time to keep my business running?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things. I mean, it could be a matter of days that you're down and out, depending on how your network infrastructure is set up. If you have full cloud redundancy, meaning that your backup solution is fully in the cloud and you can actually work from that cloud instance, that is ideal. That minimizes your downtime. If you have, cloud vendors, like Office 365, for example, for your email, there's redundancy there, so you don't have to worry about not being able to access anything. But anything that is locally hosted, anything that gets encrypted, you're going to have to recover manually. And quite frankly, you may or may not have heard there's some supply chain issues these days. So if you actually need to buy a new server, it might be a few days before you can even get a new server to reconfigure. So there's some pretty significant issues there. And, you have to expect that if you have on-site actual physical infrastructure and you get hit with ransomware, you have to assume somewhere between 2 and 5 days, probably somewhere in the ballpark of 3 to 4 of downtime, meaning that you can't function with anything that's stored locally. So having that cloud redundancy, having that cloud backup, having cloud-based applications all works in your favor when you're trying to recover and get back to, those are all going to be part of your business continuity strategy, right? And if you don't have a business continuity strategy, write that down. Get a business continuity strategy, right? If you don't know, if you can't answer the question, if you got hit with ransomware tomorrow, how would you keep your business running for the next week? If you can't answer that question, that's your first action item.
So I think most sophisticated businesses, small, medium, or large, are really looking to fail over cloud redundancy, getting their email into the cloud, getting their critical business systems like their finance system and other systems into cloud-based databases, so that if they have some sort of attack on their network, they can just fail over to the cloud. And for small businesses, this is actually tends to be easier because they have smaller footprints. So getting them into a fully cloud, full cloud environment is a lot easier than medium or large size businesses. And often it's really doable by using the Office 365 cloud. There's so much capability within that. One thing I want to talk a little bit about with respect to ransomware is cyber liability insurance. So I mentioned cyber crime insurance before. Cyber liability insurance is meant to cover the loss of information or the attack on systems. So liability insurance will cover a ransomware attack. And the nice thing about this type of insurance is there's no fault-based look. Like if your carrier came in and said, you didn't have the type of managed threat detection that Paige said you should have, that doesn't mean you don't get coverage. And so this coverage is strong, but you have to get it, and you have to get the right amount. I can't tell you how many times I have clients that come to me and say, yeah, I have cyber liability coverage, $25,000. That's going to last about 3 days of, a forensic person and a lawyer, and you're not even going to get into notification or credit and identity monitoring. Really, for most businesses that have any meaningful amount of sensitive information, whether it's, legally protected PII or otherwise, you're really looking at starting with $1 million worth of cyber liability coverage, mostly because it's just the cost of investigating with a forensic investigator, with legal, with breach notification costs, credit identity monitoring, those stack up. And if you ever have a regulatory audit after a breach, you definitely need that amount of coverage. So, really getting the right coverage in place. And I can't tell you how much I work with agents and clients to make sure that coverage is right. The other thing I'll say, and this is going to be a bit of a transition to our third topic, which is really comprehensive risk management, is I can't tell you how many times clients come to me right at the start of a breach and say, hey, I was relying on my managed IT provider to take care of me. And I have the highest degree of respect for Mainstay, and I'll say that not every managed IT provider is created equal, or not every managed IT provider does as good a job as Mainstay. And it really falls on you as the business owner, in conjunction with, if you need help from a cybersecurity attorney like me, or an outside consultant like Paige and Mainstay, to make sure you really have the type of managed IT that it takes to implement the security controls that are necessary. Many IT providers are going to kind of sell you their services on a time and materials basis, an hourly basis, or they're going to keep your systems up and running, but they're not going to necessarily be your security watchdogs. And so particularly, we see this particularly for medium and small size businesses, you need to be smart about the managed IT services that you're getting. Because most business leaders, they don't know what they are getting, and need to take time to figure that out.
Yeah,
All right.
I would just add really quickly that I think as business leaders, it's really important to understand that information security is dependent on IT security, but there is so much more to it, and it's a full organization focus, not just an IT problem, right? And so many times we get in there and, just like what Cam's saying, oh, well, IT handles that. Well, no, you have to, as a business leader, you have to lead this at the top, and you have to encourage your whole staff to be involved in this. This is a whole organization problem, not an IT problem.
All right, so let's use that as a transition, Paige. Talk a little bit about what it really means to have a comprehensive information security process and program, not just an IT process, but talk a little bit, what's the structure of that? What goes into it? How do you do it? What are the key factors? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in an information security program, you want it to actually be a program. You want it to be an intentional part, right? You plan your sales strategy, you plan your operations, you budget, you do all of these things to manage your organization. You want to do the same thing with overall security risk. You want to do the same thing with IT and information security together. You want to understand what the risk is to your organization. And in order to do that, you need to evaluate what type of information you have. I can't tell you how many times I hear an organization, well, we don't have anything that anyone would want to steal. False. I don't care. I don't care who you are. Sorry. I don't care what organization you are. If you have employees, you have information that people want to steal. If you have ever enrolled someone in benefits, you have information that people want to steal. If you have intellectual property, you have information that people want to steal. So there's all kinds of things that you have to think about when it comes to what information do you have, where does it live, how is it being accessed, how are you managing that data, and then really looking at your overarching protection from a technical, administrative, and physical perspective. If you don't have all three components, then you don't have a complete program. There are things that you have to consider when it comes to how you're approaching this from all sides of your business. So I just said, like, everybody in your organization needs to be involved in this. And so you have to understand how you're approaching it in all directions. You have to make sure that you have buy-in from your organization, that you have leadership buy-in, that you have individual end user buy-in, that they understand what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to share and manage. And then one of the other important things that actually just ties into what we were just talking about is, as organizations move into cloud-based infrastructure, it's great. But what we see happening is the exact same thing that organizations tend to do with IT. Well, I was counting on my IT provider to protect me. Oh, well, I gave that to this vendor in the cloud and it's their responsibility to protect it. Also false. So it's your information and you can make the choice to hold it locally or give it to a cloud vendor. But when you give that information to a cloud vendor, you have to understand what they're doing with it. You have to understand how they're protecting it. You have to understand what they're doing to manage their organization, what their structure looks like, and whether or not that rises to the level of your expectations, right? Like, if you ran into me on the street and said, hey, here's a folder with all of my personal information, take good care of it, right? Like, who would do that? Nobody. But if you just chuck your information up into the cloud and then don't manage that vendor relationship, that's kind of what you're doing. So you have to take a lot of ownership around that data and make sure that you have all of these things accounted for. And then once you've got them accounted for, you need to test it, you need to monitor it, and you need to fund it. So
Paige, talk a little bit more about the first step in the process. We typically call this step a risk assessment or an audit, followed by the report. And I think a lot of people know, if they know anything about cybersecurity, they think, oh, I got to have a policy. I got to have a policy that says something. But they don't know about the first step, the risk assessment report. Tell people a little bit what goes into that.
Yeah, so risk assessments are great. It's essentially a baseline of where you are from a security perspective. So we look at technical, administrative, and physical items. We look at the data that you have, the systems that you have. We understand your business process and flow, and we identify where there are threats to your organization. So one of the things that we do at Mainstay when we're doing a risk assessment is we gather all this information, and then we sit down with it and we think about, okay, if I was a hacker, right, we put on our little hacker hats and we think, okay, how would I compromise this organization? What are the threats to this organization? Where do they have gaps in their process? Where do they have data that's potentially exposed? Where do they have gaps in, staff training and awareness, right? We try to identify all of those gaps, and then we help organizations understand where they are. We help them come to terms with where they want to be. And then we start thinking about, okay, what is the gap? How do we bridge that gap? And most importantly, what are the things that we can do to bridge that gap sooner rather than later, right? What's the low-hanging fruit? I don't actually know. It's been a while since we've done a risk assessment where we haven't had to say the words multi-factor authentication. That usually comes up. So word to the wise, before you even have a risk assessment, multi-factor authentication. Just going to say it over and over again and hope it sticks. But right, we create these recommendations and we say, this is where you are, this is where you want to be. These are the things that you need to be thinking about, and here's how you prioritize it as an organization. So it's basically a baseline, and then from there, you actually build your program. From there, you start improving your processes, you start focusing on policies and training and security layers, and right, you kind of build the onion once you've got that baseline.
So Paige, we have a great question from the audience. The question is, I'm going to kind of reframe it a bit. So the question is, okay, a lot of small, medium-sized businesses use Office 365. And of course, we're not going to make an impact on Microsoft. Microsoft's not going to do a lot for us. If, we want to sign an agreement, we take their BAA. But, we can't do anything. So I operate an Office 365 environment. Why isn't it safe? What do I have to do? And talk a little bit, when you talk about this, talk about email, OneDrive, Azure. How can we use Office 365 for small and medium-sized businesses to give them a really good security footing. So take this in a two-part, what do they have to do, and how can this be an asset to small, medium-sized businesses?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And you aren't going to make any impact on Microsoft. However, Microsoft specifically has a ton of really fantastic security features. And what you need to do is you need to understand what features you have available to you, what those features are, and then ensure that you're using them. So things like all the things that we've talked about, right? Making sure that you're enforcing long and strong passwords, making sure that you are, limiting access. So one of the things that happens a lot in Office 365 is this portal that is open to the world, and you can connect to it from any device, right? So if somebody's on a cruise, they can connect to Office 365 from their cruise ship on this random shared computer, right? That's not safe. So look at all the things that you have, look at what your risk is, look at the data that you're trying to protect in your email, and then make risk-based decisions as to what security layers you're going to put in place. Multi-factor authentication, there's monitoring that you can turn on, there's things like mobile device management, which is a really important piece and may or may not be included in your Microsoft license. That's something that you'll have to, I don't have a PhD in Microsoft licensing, which is what you need to actually manage that. But look at that and see what other options there are, because you have to think about, if I have access to Office 365, I can put it in OneDrive, right? Where can I access OneDrive? Well, depending on your configuration, they could access it from anywhere, or they could access it from your office. Right? I can access my OneDrive on my phone. Do I have the right protections on individual people's phones? Do I know where that information can go, where it should go? Does my team know what they should and shouldn't do with that information? So really, it's a matter of exploring all of the security features and functions that you have, and then enabling as many of them as make sense for your organization.
Right. And some small, medium-sized businesses are going to have an in-house IT person that can do that can configure Office 365, can make these settings be what Paige is describing. And other small, medium-sized businesses are not. And so what a company like Mainstay will do for a small, medium-sized business is manage your Office 365 environment. So they will configure it so that you have the right passwords, you have multi-factor authentication. Office 365 has an application that they can deploy to mobile phones called a mobile device manager, an MDM. So you're going to need somebody to flip the switches in Office 365 the right way. And then you get a ton of security. One of the things in Office 365 is something called Azure or Azure, depending on who says it. And that's like a big cloud. So you can put databases in Azure. And by virtue of doing that, you can apply all of these Microsoft Office 365 security controls to all of the data that you put in there. And so to the question in the crowd, Office 365 is not necessarily particularly secure. Hey, Tricia, just put yourself on mute. Thank you. So in its basic format, Office 365 is not going to have all the security controls. You got to do that. Either have somebody in-house to do it, or retain an outside firm to do it.
Yeah, I would add just one more thing onto that question, Peter. When you're thinking about other cloud vendors, right? So Microsoft is obviously a monstrous organization, right? When you're talking with other vendors, smaller vendors who are providing, some sort of cloud-based application, there is a lot that you can do with them to understand what their security posture is. You can ask them for any security review that they've had, like a SOC 2 is a really typical one that we ask for. It's a security assessment. You can ask them to send you what's in your policies, like how are you training your staff? What are your expectations around how information is managed? Can your staff access our information in your cloud, right? Who has access to what? So there's a lot that you can do with smaller organizations to understand and learn about how they're managing and protecting your information. The other thing is that you can depending on the type of application. But in your contracts, you can add information that says, if you have a compromise, you need to let us know within a certain period of time. Not all cloud vendors are going to include that information voluntarily. So you can push for those things. You can push for that type of information that then further ties them into your security posture and gives you a little bit more teeth when it comes to dealing with some of those situations. It doesn't prevent it, but it at least gives you a little bit more oversight and a little bit more control when it comes to what they're doing.
Yeah. One of the things that we identify when we do a risk assessment is the various clouds that are used and the vendors and who they are. And what flows out of that is identifying, okay, these are the clouds you're using, which of them have multi-factor authentication, which of them have strong passwords, how are we going to manage them? There are ways to manage multiple clouds using a single application. So the risk assessments are really good for identifying that. And then the reports that come out from the risk assessments will list your vendors, and you use that as a checklist to do your vendor management and to do your due diligence like Paige was talking about, and get your vendors signed up with the right types of contracts.
Yep.
All right. Go ahead, Paige.
I was just going to say, one thing that we have also been hearing a little bit in the industry is that there's a lot of question around penetration testing. Penetration testing is not a risk assessment. Just to be really, really clear, they're not the same. A penetration test could potentially be part of a risk assessment, but it's a very different technical, specific, gap-focused assessment. A risk assessment is much broader and organization-wide, so don't mix up the two. The risk assessment, for the value that you get for the money that you will spend on a risk assessment, far exceeds what you will get from a pen test, which has a very important place in security, but is not a risk assessment.
And is usually not particularly useful to a small or medium-sized business. A pen test is something that a business does once they're deep into the maturity on cybersecurity. So think of cybersecurity like a colander. A business has a lot of holes when you first start the process, and you close the obvious ones up. Pen tests usually come 3 or 4 steps down the line when you can't find the holes. And so you're looking for somebody on the outside to come in and find the holes that you didn't find. Typically, these pen tests they can be quite expensive. So Paige is exactly right. For most small, medium-sized businesses or businesses that don't have a high level of maturity yet, your money is much better spent finding the big holes through a risk assessment.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions from the audience? You get to ask anything of the cybersecurity experts you want to. No question will be rejected. Anybody? All right, Stephanie, I will turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think there was so many good takeaways from that talk. I think your point of, antivirus software isn't enough, anti-malware isn't enough. It's like, oh, that just used to be the thing, right? Like you just put that on and off you go, and everything is changing so rapidly and so quickly in this space. It's great to have presentations like this to be able to talk to that. And there's so many providers out there who are here to help people and businesses protect themselves. And then the other one too is kind of opening up that conversation. If you work with a managed service provider, what are they doing? Are they doing anything? Because a lot of people do assume that they are taken care of there. So I think, here at the Tech Alliance, we're really passionate about spreading the message of cybersecurity and helping small businesses in New Hampshire. I think we work really closely with Mainstay and love what they do there. And through our program, I'm not going to call it a cybersecurity assessment. It is not an assessment. It's a much larger, more in-depth process. But, the program that we've developed with the SBDC is to just kind of get people into cybersecurity. It can feel intimidating for sure to get started. And this is just meant to be a high level review. What are you doing? Are you doing anything? And if not, that's okay too. And here's some suggestions, and just kind of start you on your journey there. So thank you to Tam and Paige and everyone for attending today. We really appreciate it. And Hope you all have a great day.